Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles.
And I'm Samantha Miller.
And this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it.
Welcome to the Wildlife Wire, Michelle Lute, and that's Dr. Michelle Lute. She is a wildlife biologist who has worked in carnivore coexistence and has her PhD in wildlife conservation science. She's worked for the state of New Mexico and for the National Park Service, and she is now the executive director of Wildlife for All. Michelle brings to us a wealth of knowledge on state wildlife management and how states manage wild animals really for humans around the country. And we're thrilled to have you here today. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
It is so good to have you. And we are really excited to hear about your state reform work. But I think before we dig into the work that Wildlife for All is doing, I'd love for our listeners to know a little bit about your path to becoming the executive director of this organization and some of your past work that led you to really uncover the need for wildlife reform.
Yeah, that's an excellent question that will kind of feed into why I saw the need for wildlife reform. So
Wonderful.
Yeah, I'm a Johnny Cash song. I've been everywhere, man.
Good. Well, welcome here.
I'm here now.
Well, I'm a boy named Sue, so hello.
Wow.
Thanks.
Thanks, you, Mark.
So I've lived in multiple states, multiple countries, done conservation all over the place. And a lot of it was focused on addressing what I saw early in my career as one of the biggest challenges to conservation, which is human-wildlife conflict. So I chased long-tailed macaque monkeys around Singapore to understand their situation with humans in a highly dense urban city-state. Potential for disease transmittance, but also just lots of conflict, like monkeys stealing food from kitchens or stealing fruit from yards, a lot like raccoons in North America, basically. So trying to understand that situation was really what got me started and launched into this career, where I ended up focusing on human carnivore conflict as one of the biggest fights. It was like, where is the greatest need? One of the biggest fights is around carnivores and how to manage and protect them. So I did a PhD in wolf management in Michigan, looking at how to move from conflict to coexistence. Then, I've worked at the state level, the federal level, multiple nonprofit organizations on lots of different issues. And the theme that kept coming up is that decision-making about wildlife is not democratic. And it's actually really limited in most cases. So the irony is that if you're not lucky enough, I put lucky in air quotes, if you're not lucky enough to be listed on the Endangered Species Act, which means you're already in big trouble, right? So not very lucky. But that's the only conservation attention that we get, especially on the federal level for wildlife species in North America. And at the state level, it's mostly focused on hunting, fishing, and where states still allow it, trapping. And that's the state of conservation. So working on all these different issues, trying to end trapping, trying to end wildlife killing contests, I realized that, we keep doing this state by state by state. And at the heart of it is the lack of a democratic process. And so that's how I came to be executive director of Wildlife for All, is to address that lack of democracy, that lack of inclusion in decision making, to make sure that we're addressing the twin crises of climate change and mass extinction, which is not happening at the state or federal level. But states can be a front line for democratic defense in a time where democracy is eroding in America. So that was a lot, but that's a little bit about my background and how I got to be here talking to you today.
Awesome. Well, I have a very important question to start with. And as you were chasing monkeys around and they were stealing things, did you ever encounter drunk monkeys?
I never encountered drunk monkeys. I know it happens. I encountered monkeys who have some pretty gnarly addictions to sugar. So I've
man,
monkeys drinking out of Coca-Cola bottles, and they're obese. They're overweight.
Oh no,
really unhealthy.
Yeah, well,
they rely too much on human trash.
Yeah, well, you're talking to two people with 7-year-olds that react to sugar probably the same way a monkey does.
Yes,
So we get it.
I agree. And Michelle, when you were mentioning your background, and I'm going to ask a question not about drunk monkeys, Mark. So I want to make sure you're done with that discussion item before I redirect this conversation to a conservation question. Do you have any follow-ups on the drunk monkeys or sugar addicted monkeys?
No, no, it's serious time now.
No. I am curious, Michelle. You had mentioned that you were drawn to human carnivore conflict because that was where you saw the greatest amount of conflict. Can you discuss your experience with that a little bit more, and why do you think that is?
My answer will be mostly focused on wolves because that's what the species that I've focused most on in terms of coexistence. So it really has to do, I think, with human perceptions around wolves and human identity groups competing over access to natural resources, access to nature, access to decision makers. And it's, our root tribalism coming out when we stop listening to each other and start competing over who gets to decide or influence the decision makers on these issues. So in the case of wolves, they're such a political animal. Coyotes to a certain extent too, are just perceived not as the animal and its environment, but as a symbol for so many other things. Probably most folks listening to this podcast have heard a little bit about symbolism around carnivores, particularly around wolves being considered government dogs or, the harbinger of federal government oversight. And that leads to resentment from those groups. So it's a very, great question with a lot of, I mean, we could spend a whole podcast or two on digging into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we could. And I hope you've never seen any drunk wolves. That would be my first hope. My second question, though, is you talked about different identities clashing, and often what we hear as pushback as we look at changing these systems is that follow the science, keep things the way they are, or defer to the agency, follow the science. And that's often coming from groups that are predator hunters or fur trappers. How did how is science weaponized by these identities, and how is it removed from the conversation of carnivore conflicts?
Such a good question because science does get weaponized. That's a great way to put it. Depending on the group, they're going to answer different to the question of, whose science counts, right? What is the best available science? And science evolves, right? And it only answers the questions that we ask. So for a long time, we were using science to answer questions like, how many coyotes can we kill before we see a population decline? Or the same with wolves or mountain lions. What's the, best poison to kill lots of coyotes across the landscape, right? That was the science, those were the scientific questions being asked for a long time. So we have that body of research, and then we have more modern body of research asking questions about, like, wait, is non-lethal more effective than lethal tools? What does an unexploited wolf population look like if we don't have humans killing them? How stable could, population dynamics and family pack dynamics be if we weren't going in and creating chaos with lethal control? So that's, a little bit about, how science has evolved. And some people want to stick to the older science because it tells them what they want to hear and they ignore the newer stuff. So that's, I think, part of how it gets weaponized. But I think it's also a distraction from what the real issue is, which is a disagreement on values, a disagreement on who in the natural world has intrinsic value and what uses might trump that intrinsic value. So when should a wolf be killed, right? That's a value-based judgment. Science can tell us what the outcomes of certain methods might be, but they can't tell us what we ought to do or not do. That's ethics and values. So I think the focus on science is sometimes a distraction from explicitly acknowledging our biases and our values.
Yeah, and so you spoke of how we've used science a lot in the past to say how many can we kill before we are having big negative consequences on populations. How often are you seeing that they're not even doing any of that science on populations? And at the same time, like allowing unlimited killing.
Yes, so often, state by state, there are a number of species that don't have any regulations and are not being studied to understand their population levels. And that goes from bobcats to foxes to coyotes, of course, to say nothing of other species that, don't have protections like porcupines, raccoons. Um,
Porcupines have protections. They're just their own protections.
there you go.
They're a little spiky.
Porcupine said, I got this myself.
Sure. Sure you do. No, I agree. And I think those species are often just labeled for what they're used for by humans, right? Those species are often labeled fur bearers or big game, and each of those words really diminishes their value
Mm,
to people too and how we label them. But these values that we're using to decide, okay, we're going to kill all of these animals in Colorado, for example, you can kill an unlimited number of any fur bearer during fur harvest season. So that's bobcats, that's mink, martens, ringtails, foxes. All of those species can be trapped in unlimited numbers. Have you ever seen a study where they say, what if we didn't trap for a season? How healthy would that ecosystem be? What if we didn't hunt this species in one management unit for a season? How would that change that ecosystem or 5 seasons? Enough time to see the difference in all of the species that might be impacted by that one hunt. Has it ever happened?
Yeah, there have been studies, some of them small scale for just one season as a control to compare to a lethal control, looking at, wolves and caribou in British Columbia, for instance. There's probably a number of other examples, but I think the most compelling and also the most controversial example is looking at some of our national parks, like famously Yellowstone National Park, where wolves, for the most part, haven't been exploited and they've been protected in the park. Now, that has changed recently with liberalized killing of wolves around Yellowstone, such that they've been baited. Individuals that have most of their territory in the park have been baited and then killed as soon as they leave park boundaries. So, even that is not a protected space. But we do have decades of research in Yellowstone showing the how wolf populations stabilize when they're at effective densities, ecologically effective densities, and the outsized benefits that they beget across the landscape. The controversy comes in, and a lot of people say, well, we're not seeing that anywhere else. Well, wolves aren't protected anywhere else. They're completely exploited everywhere, including the individuals that leave the park. So even there, that is probably somewhat limited microcosm. So if we had more examples of unexploited carnivore populations, we would probably be seeing trophic cascades demonstrated in lots and lots of places. But right now, it's very limited. So a lot of people say, "Oh, that Yellowstone study, those aren't good studies, or that's not really applicable." Well, it's not applicable because we're killing them everywhere, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and Yellowstone's really the only place you can see that because of the land size of Yellowstone, too. A lot of other areas don't have that large space protected. Go ahead, Mark. You had a question.
Oh yeah, I had a comment too on Yellowstone. So I got to hear Doug Smith talk a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how packs in Yellowstone, they form complex packs, like multi-generational packs, where if you go outside of the park, then, and what we will most likely have here are simple packs because they are often having their territories disrupted. They're losing pack members due to hunting and trapping pressure. And so, you know, they don't have those benefits of protection to where they can have these pack sizes that they want to have, right? And so they're almost operating more like coyotes do. And this might be outside of your area of expertise, but I was curious your thoughts on coyotes and wolves. And, so sometimes people say, well, wolves kill coyotes. So we don't have wolves in wherever location. And so I'm filling that void. But to me, that's a lot different dynamic because the hunter is coming in, taking one coyote out, leaving, and then that's it. Do you have any experience on like how different it is to have a hunter kill a coyote versus wolves on the landscape living with coyotes and suppressing their populations that way?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Mm. There's a number of studies that look at, whether we can consider human hunters as a replacement for other predators. What we found for so many reasons, humans choose to take different individuals than what would happen in a non-anthropogenic setting where, a wolf is defending a territory and would take a certain individual. Humans are, they're going after trophy animals, right? So they're choosing different individuals. Age and sex classes could both be different between the two. I don't know specifically, but I imagine they're vastly different dynamics in the responses that an individual would have to human mortality versus other mortality is also quite different.
Yeah, that whole area is fascinating to me. I do want to shift back over to state agencies and policies and get your thoughts. Do you have specific states that you would grade higher than others? And what kinds of, if you do, what kinds of policies or outreach to different user groups or interests are they doing versus the ones that maybe aren't doing so well?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. For a while, I was pointing to Colorado and Washington as doing a really good job at diversifying representation on their commissions, which are the ultimate decision makers on wildlife policy at the state level. Washington has a new governor, and we're seeing, my exact concern, the concern that we've seen play out in lots of places is when you lose a good governor that's committed to conservation and democracy, all of those reforms and all of that progress around good conservation policy goes away because they replace commissioners and appoint them with their friends. We see this cronyism happening in so many places. So Washington was going in the right direction, and now that progress has been stalled. You two can talk more informed about Colorado than I can, but Governor Polis has been pretty serious about appointing some better commissioners. And so we've seen more democratic policy and process in response. I can point to pieces, elements of reform that have been helpful in other states, such as Missouri's sales tax, which means their agency is one of the most well-funded wildlife agencies across the country. That hasn't always translated to the policies we'd like to see around protecting carnivores, stopping black bear hunting, that sort of thing. So it's still limited, and it speaks to the need to both shift the culture in agencies and commissions, defend democracy, and diversify the funding. There's a number of reform elements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've witnessed time and again that even Democrats will trade for wildlife for other priority needs. So
Right.
even if someone is a progressive, they may trade for wildlife. I've also seen conservatives really, throw down for wildlife every once in a
Yeah.
while too.
Yeah.
So it's really a roll of the dice there, and I think that's the problem with wildlife management now is that it's not democratic. New Mexico is making some progress on this, though, correct? We just had a news story the other week about legislation passing in New Mexico that reshapes how wildlife is managed. Could you tell us how that works and what happened behind the scenes and what is this big vision that this could bring forward?
Yeah. So you're referring to Senate Bill 5 that's now passed into law. Various elements of the bill will be coming into effect over the course of a couple years, actually, but it does four main things. So it modernizes the mission of the Department of Game and Fish. It also changes the name. So the name won't be Department of Game and Fish anymore. It'll be the Department of Wildlife, and the commission will be the State Wildlife Commission. So it changes the name, and then it modernizes the mission to really have the ability to regulate take and protect any and all species of wildlife, and also to consider the science-based reasons for protections of species. So the department has been doing that to a certain extent, but this codifies it in law and statute. So that's a really important move for expanding the authority and really being able to point to part of the mission of this agency isn't just to manage harvestable surpluses of game and fish, but it's also to protect species based on science-informed decision-making. So that's really powerful. It also establishes a professionalized, nonpartisan wildlife commission with a nominating committee that gives candidates to the governor to consider. And so they're expanding some of those qualifications to include scientific expertise and diverse representation. It includes a tribal representative and a conservationist, true conservationist. And so that's another big part of the progress. And then, as I alluded to before, it increases state agency funding, which is so important, especially in New Mexico, where license fees had not been increased for a really long time. And so the agency does still rely on hunting and fishing license fees, and they're now being increased for the first time in decades with some provisions around folks who receive SNAP benefits get discounted hunting and fishing licenses so they can still procure wild game meat at a discounted price. And then it also, in a separate bill, secures $10.5 million for state agencies to do non-game conservation work, basically focused on species of greatest conservation need. And that's $10.5 million over the course of the next 3 years, and we're hoping to solidify that sort of funding in perpetuity to be able to continue supporting conservation funding that's not reliant on hunting and license fees.
There's a lot there. I'm going to maybe do two of them, and then Sam can finish it off. The first piece is a comment with a question in that the renaming. And while that seems like it could be, a small item, it is huge because, traditionally these agencies have catered to the hunting, trapping, and fishing communities. And so calling it wildlife kind of sends a message like, hey, no, this is about the animals. My first question is, how do we get more people to understand that these agencies are for them as well, to be they have a voice in what happens to wildlife?
That is, it starts with, I think it starts with the name. I mean, just saying, like, I'm going to a fish and game meeting, a fish and game commission meeting. Like, that doesn't sound like a place for me. But going to a wildlife commission meeting makes a lot more sense. So words do matter, and it signals this expanded mission and the importance of addressing protection of wildlife, not just exploitation. So I think that's first and foremost. And then diversifying the representation so that the commission actually cares about your voice. And that's, transparent democratic process. And that's having diverse people who represent the people in your state. If it's just what it has been, which is, a good old boys club, there's a lot of people who don't feel comfortable going up there because they know those people, those commissioners are not going to listen to their interests and perspectives and probably don't even know anything about their interests or perspectives or background. So I do think that also diversifying the commission helps signal to people that your interests are represented and will be heard. But it's an uphill battle. It's really hard because it's still, you've still got a lot of people defending the status quo, and you're still asking wildlife advocates to show up to a meeting that has been mostly dominated by people who do not look like you, do not talk like you, do not share your values, and can be even antagonistic towards you. So we're constantly trying to motivate people to show up to their commission meetings and build relationships. And it's a brave step to start doing that. But once you do that, you realize we're all humans and you can relate to people on a human to human basis. This is, again, getting back to my social identity theory that I've studied in my academic life, is once you can take away those signals that you're a certain representative of a certain identity group, and just relate to someone one-on-one interpersonally, that can really change the dynamic. So you can talk to a hunter and realize, oh, actually, we have these common values. But that doesn't happen when you just assume this person is other, this person is different, right? And so I think building relationships and going to those commission meetings month by month or as frequently as your state has them is really important to that.
Yeah, I agree. And one on the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission, it's amazing what it is today as far as diversity goes, and even within some of the seats that are like specific for one user group, the person representing them is even like different from the traditional person that would be in there. So it's really encouraging to see that. And then the other thing is, yes, I agree, when advocates start going to meetings and then and it empowers them, but then also I think it can help both sides cool the temperature a little bit if we can start having some small talk with someone that we maybe have disagreed or vilified even in the past. And then, just having a little bit of communication can cool those temps, and maybe, people don't attack as hard as they have in the past. So, we have 11 commissioners here. So in New Mexico, it's 3, is that correct? That's going to be on there?
It's 7. Actually.
7, okay. And then I had a question about the conservationist. What does that mean?
Yeah. So there's 3 at-large members, and that includes the tribal representative. And then there's 4 members with various requirements or qualifications. And the conservationist is I've got the bill language up. So it's a person who for the previous 4 years has been an employee, a member of the board, or a member of an established advisory committee of a nonprofit wildlife or habitat conservation organization, the primary focus of which is not game species. So
Cool.
that's the requirement for the conservationist position. We've sort of had a conservationist seat in the past, but that's been filled by like an oil and gas executive. So it really this might seem like, oh yeah, of course, but there aren't those sort of people on most commissions. So codifying this is a big step in the right direction.
Yeah, it's always a fine line to walk between ambiguity and flexibility, and how to kind of problem solve for that ahead of time. So I applaud you for taking that on. I think our conversations about people also lend to my question about species, and you brought this up too. And I think this is something that's really exciting about the New Mexico legislation is that right now, most game agencies or fish and wildlife agencies, or however they're called in their states, feel like very exclusive clubs. They're exclusive to the people who know the ins and outs of how to participate, who even know how to volunteer, right? Most agencies allow volunteers or have volunteer programs, and it's generally just consumptive users participating. And they're exclusive as far as species that they consider in their management and in their budget. And I think that most folks don't understand that when a wildlife agency manages wildlife, and that's with air quotes since folks can't see this, they're managing a specific species and generally for a specific use, not looking at, oh, this is an ecosystem that could benefit from, more carnivores. So we're moving elk around because it's a riparian area and that would be better for fish habitat, or more beavers, even though it causes a floodplain because we need the habitat here for different migrating songbirds. But instead we look at how many can we kill, same with beavers, for people and not even at those songbirds some of the time. So your legislation adds $10.5 million specifically for non-game species. Is that correct? And that's brand new. I know Washington passed, I think it was like 1.7 million, but 10.5 is huge, and that can totally change the tone of an agency because they never think that way. Could you discuss that a bit more and what kind of uses that goes towards?
Yeah, well, we're still, it's brand new, so we're still digging into the details, but it's coming from what's called the Land of Enchantment Legacy Fund. And so this is a big pot of money that legislators decide how to dole out. And as part of it was a separate bill, but from some of the same co-sponsors and supporters of SB 5, HB 2, which was the General Appropriations Act of 2025. So Nathan Small is a legislator who is a real champion for this funding. And so we've been very thankful to him and his work, along with Matthew McQueen, who was really the champion of SB 5. But anyhow, they worked together with their colleagues and pushed this big pot of money. And it'll go towards focusing on species of greatest conservation need. And as I understand it, there's also earmarked funding within that big pot of money that's going towards wildlife conservation, specifically for beavers. And I think there's probably some other specifics that I haven't been able to track quite yet. But yeah, so it's species of greatest conservation need, which are those listed under a state's Wildlife Action Plan, or SWAP, which are being revised in most states in 2025, due by at some point, I think the end of September. Is when these revisions to state wildlife action plans should be finalized in all the states that are reviewing them. Anyhow, so that will go towards species who are, as the name suggests, in need of conservation. So all these once abundant species that are now declining, that aren't on a state or federal endangered species list yet, and there is some overlap, but a lot of species aren't. So in New Mexico, that's, pinyon jays, who used to be one of the most abundant birds in the Southwest and are now steeply declining in response to habitat fragmentation and climate change. So we're very excited about that, but it's only 3 years of funding. So that's limited in, say, hiring new permanent biologists that are focused on non-game. So that's why it's really important to make sure that we can secure this funding in the future, because 3 years and 10.5 million sounds like a lot, and that's great, but it goes quickly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how $10.5 million is a drop in the bucket these days. Yeah. And I would be curious too, like how many of these agencies really would like to do more research on non-game species, but when all of your efforts have to be put into bringing in more money from game species, then you're just kind of stuck in this cycle. And without that dedicated fund over here, it doesn't matter what their intentions, what their desires are for these other species. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. I go to conferences and talk to state wildlife biologists and other agency folks, and they need enhanced funding. They want to do that work, but they're stuck in this status quo that's a user pays model, it's a client-based model. At least that's the perception. So a lot of states do rely on hunting, fishing, and trapping licenses. But at the federal level, they get money from Pittman-Robertson, and that has often been used to support this mythology that hunting is conservation and hunting pays for all conservation, when nowadays most people who buy the items that are taxed through Pittman-Robertson. So
And can you explain Pittman-Robertson real quick?
so this is a long-standing sales tax on all kinds of outdoor equipment that has traditionally been focused on hunting and fishing. Well, there's Dingle Johnson, which is for aquatic stuff and for fishing. Pittman-Robertson is focused on hunting. So basically a sales tax on guns and ammunition and that sort of thing. Those people now are engaged in shooting sports or buying guns for home defense and not for hunting. So 73% of the sales tax from Pittman-Robertson is coming from non-hunting sources. So some agencies are enterprise agencies, and they really are reliant on this user pays, client-based model. But at the federal level, the funding going to state wildlife agencies from Pittman-Robertson dollars is not from hunting. So I think it's important to realize how that is shifting and the nuances and changes in the funding source. And also, states like New Mexico, the state land office, they've started implementing conservation fees. So if you want to use land, again, use in air quotes.
We need like an air quote, like horn or something.
Yeah. I don't know about a horn, but maybe like a nice
like a chime.
chime.
Yeah. I need that too. But yeah, so I mean, there's nothing to say that we couldn't be pulling in more money from other outdoor rec and conservation activities. But the status quo defenders have, blocked those initiatives in the past. So that's another area of reform and expansion for diversified funding.
Yeah, I think we could do a whole episode where we had you on and talk about what is diversified funding, what kind of sources can that come from. Sam, did you have a question? I have one question that might be a big one. I'm not sure.
Oh gosh. Okay, I will give you the last final big question, unless it's about drunk monkeys, and then
I'm
no
done with the
question for
drunk
you.
monkeys, all right? No
Okay,
more
go
drunk
ahead.
monkeys. So, with this bill in New Mexico, there were multiple user groups that were involved in its formation, right? And so how long did it take? What kind of feedback did you hear about compromises being made one way or another? Was it hostile? Were there shoes being thrown? What was going on?
Take this flip flop to slam the flip flop down. Okay, go
Give
ahead.
me the dirt.
Forward into secrecy on the shoe flying. Can answer the other.
All right. We're here for the tea, Michelle. We're here for the coalition building tea. Go for it.
It actually was a really effective coalition that came together for this bill. And a large portion of the folks involved in that coalition, I should also mention, had worked together already for many, many years to pass Roxy's Law, which bans traps, poisons, and snares on New Mexico's public lands. So there was already precedent. But for both of these efforts, for Roxy's Law and for SB 5, this reform legislation, it took multiple attempts. So a version of this bill was passed in the last full legislative session in 2023 and pocket vetoed by the governor. And so got very far bipartisan support based on this really diverse coalition. And they persisted and kept coming back and kept, going to the table with the governor's office to get to a place where she was going to be comfortable signing this bill. And yeah, I can't speak highly enough to all the coalition members. And it's really interesting because it spanned the gamut from animal protection voters, so a New Mexico-based group that's really about animal protection, as is in their name, all the
And their
way.
voters.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Thank you. All the way to, the other end of the spectrum, National Wildlife Federation, which is very pro hunting, but in New Mexico has a great chapter leader who's open to coming to the table with folks like animal protection voters and everybody in between. And that spoke to an understanding of the real need for reform. And New Mexico is not especially unique in its need, but it was very clear to diverse folks in the wildlife community that something needed to be changed when we couldn't even keep enough commissioners in seats to have a quorum at times. And that was in part because of political decision making, votes from commissioners that made the governor remove those individuals. So they needed protection and process. And so we've all seen for many, many years the need in New Mexico, like there is everywhere, to reform and modernize the agency and address, what we all can't ignore, which are these twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. So I think that was a big motivator. We're seeing it, drought and all kinds of things play out, wildfires play out in the Southwest in a way that we cannot ignore. So it's about protecting our landscapes and the places that we share and love, even if we don't necessarily always agree on how to manage certain wildlife. We knew that there needed to be these changes, and they're democratic changes. So they protect everybody's right to be included in the process. This was not anti-hunting by any means. This was democratic process in which all voices are considered. And that's really compelling, I think, especially at this time where we're seeing the erosion of democracy across the country.
Yeah, absolutely, Michelle. And I really want to learn more too about that messaging, because I think there's so many nuances around building those big tent coalitions. So perhaps that's something we can talk about more at a later date. I'm wondering too if you have this issue that I think I've seen in a lot of other states that probably could have blocked something like this in New Mexico. And that's right now the minority group, the hunters and fishers, have undue influence on the legislature and on the state agencies. And so for equality to happen, they feel like they're being oppressed, right? Because they lose some of the power that they already had. How did you navigate that power exchange? Because by nature, making something more democratic means that groups that are buying these hunting and fishing licenses and have traditionally participated in these systems of power have to make space for the others that don't participate. How did that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, again, it started with the shared understanding that change needed to happen. But there were certain elements in the bill that also assuaged other stakeholders. So there's a seat on the commission that will be dedicated to a person who's both a hunter and an angler. So they also got a dedicated seat. Not that they didn't already have representation, but it was codified in law in a way that was protected them and made them feel more comfortable with this legislation. But again, I think it really speaks to a shared understanding that wildlife is managed as a public trust. And, at its heart, SB5 is about trusting the public and all of its, diverse perspectives. And democracy is messy. There's no way of getting around that. But if you have process that everyone trusts and an agreement around that shared trust, the shared public trust, I think that really assuaged concerns that this isn't just a private resource for a narrow group, and that a lot of people care about wildlife and are willing to spend their hard-earned dollars to protect wildlife, and everybody benefits.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And that gives me a lot of hope. So thank you for that, Michelle. Can you tell folks how they can find you and learn more about Wildlife for All?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So, started our website, which is wildlifeforall.us. So, not .org, not .com, but .us, wildlifeforall.us. And there you'll find resources to learn everything about the system as a whole. Also, there's a Find Your State feature, so you can find details on your specific state. You can sign up for our newsletter if you're really interested in getting involved in our coalition. You can email us. And then you can also check out our blog under media resources. There's a ton of information. Our communications director, Mandy Culbertson, who was on the Wildlife Wire a couple months ago now.
Yeah, way back when.
Yeah. She is prolific at putting out a lot of great information on that blog. So that is also a good way to kind of find out what's happening. And then we're on, social media like everybody else. So we ask that people follow. And I think specifically around this governance reform, sharing the story of SB5, I think is so important we don't usually have a whole lot of wins. So it's awesome to for once not be the Debbie Downer and hopeful and inspirational. So share that hope and inspiration around SB5. It's not just a policy win, and it's not just a thing in New Mexico. It's a narrative shift about who gets to decide the future of wildlife. And so we want to bring that kind of victory and democracy and true, authentic wildlife conservation to every state in the country. So get involved and talk to people and form your own groups. And we're here for resources to share with whatever you need to do good governance reform in your state.
Yeah, we're having a documentary filmmaker on soon. And I was just like, oh, they need to make a documentary about with the folks involved in this and the relationships and what they want to see from their wildlife agencies. It could be really cool and inspirational. But
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, but thank you again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Likewise,
thanks, Michelle.
This has been an episode of the Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.